Welcome to episode 52 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode in the show notes at www.7, all spelled out, so SEVEN, health.com/52.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Real Health Radio. This is another show where it's me on my own, and today's topic is all about light. So when people are talking about things that you should be doing to increase your health, like the common things that come up as part of that list are things like diet, or including more whole foods, or getting someone to be doing more movement and exercise, or making sure they're taking in enough water or fluids, or being hydrated, or getting proper sleep, or managing stress. And one of the most underappreciated things that affect our health, from my perspective, is light. And this is largely to do with the sunlight, but given how much time we spend indoors and that we use light when the sun has set, this also includes the light in your house or in your office, and the light that is emitted from things like computers or TV screens or tablets and phones and that kind of thing. And there seems to regularly be a focus on like ancestral diets and how much such and such tribe ate and how they stayed healthy. And people like to then try and follow this way of eating. But what is often missing with this approach isn't the diet, but the fact that these people were spending the majority of their time outside exposed to sunlight. And this light exposure can be just as important to their health as the foods that they were eating or the low-grade movement that they were constantly doing. So what I want to do with today's episode of the podcast is to run through some of the different wavelength spectrums and how they can affect your health. And some of these are time specific, so you want to be getting them at certain points of the day and not others, and I'll go through that. And I'll also give you some practical suggestions of how you can be making changes with this stuff. And while I use the word light, and I'm going to continue using the word light through this podcast, what I'm actually talking about are certain frequencies on the electromagnetic spectrum. So for most of history, visible light was only known, or the only known part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And the ancient Greeks recognized that light traveled in straight lines and spent time studying some of its properties. But the first discovery of electromagnetic radiation other than visible light came in the 1800s with William Herschel, who discovered infrared radiation. He was studying the temperature of different colors by moving a thermometer through the light slit by a prism, and he noticed that the highest temperature was beyond red. So he theorized that this temperature change was due to a type of light that could not be seen. The following year, a guy called John Ritter, working at the other end of the spectrum, noticed what he called chemical rays, so invisible light rays that induced certain chemical reactions, and these were then later named as ultraviolet radiation. Further research then over the years led to the discovery of things like radio waves and microwaves, and then finally gamma rays. So we have this whole range of waves on the electromagnetic spectrum, all of which are different sizes and then do different things. And so the ones that fall under the bracket of light rays that I want to focus on as part of this show are UV rays. In the visible light spectrum, looking at like blue light and red light, and then also looking at near infrared light. So starting with UV light. UV light is probably the light range that most people have heard about. And people's knowledge of it is usually that it's the UV light that causes burnt skin or causes sun cancer, and so we should be wearing sunscreen or we should be avoiding the light. And this is typically about the extent of what people know or think they know when they hear UV light. So I want to expand this knowledge a little bit. So UV stands for ultraviolet, and violet is the color with the highest frequency that we can actually see. So ultraviolet has a frequency that is higher than violet, but we can't actually see it. So while the human eye can't see ultraviolet light, Some insects and mammals and birds actually can. So, for example, a reindeer uses near UV light to see polar bears who are poorly visible in regular light because they blend in with the snow. UV light also allows mammals to see urine trails, which can then be helpful for prey animals to find their food in the wild. But despite the fact that we as humans can't see UV light, it does have a real impact on our health. And one of the most important things we need UV light for is its vitamin D production. And when UV light hits the skin, specifically UVB, it converts cholesterol into cholecalciferol. And this substance then gets taken up by the liver and then the kidneys, and it's then converted into the active form of vitamin D. And vitamin D has many roles in the body. It is intimately linked with calcium and aids with its digestion and its absorption. It helps to protect against a growing list of diseases and everything from diabetes through to depression. UV light also helps with the production of a substance called cholesterol sulfate. And this is a substance that most people don't really talk about, but it's incredibly helpful or important for health. And possibly some of the benefits that are associated with vitamin D are actually because of cholesterol sulfate instead of the vitamin D. So in your skin and bloodstream, you have a substance called sulfide. And when it is exposed to UV, it's converted into cholesterol sulfate. And it protects the body from UV damage. It's used by the liver as part of detoxification. It reduces inflammation and can help with things like cardiovascular disease and diabetes. It supports the immune function. So the next beneficial factor of UV light is the production of melanin. And so melanin is produced from the oxidation of the amino acid tyrosine in the presence of UV. And it is the melanin that actually leads to the browning or the tanning of your skin. And part of the reason for the increased production of melanin is that it is able to dissipate the absorbed UV radiation, reducing the risk of damage. So melanin's primary role in the body is to protect it from the damage UV, while allowing us to get the UV light to then be helping with the production of vitamin D or cholesterol sulfate or other factors that I'll talk about in a sec. But while melanin's main role is as a protector, it does provide other health benefits. So it's linked with brain and nerve function. It also helps to protect against other light rays, so things like X-rays. It has a role in energy production and impacting on food intake. And it's also possibly involved in regulating reproduction. So the final role of UV light is something that I'm going to actually link into some of the other different wavelengths as well. And it's how it affects water in our cells. Now, when most people think about energy production, they think about how food that we eat is converted into energy. So you eat, say, some carbohydrates, it gets digested, it moves into your bloodstream, it then moves into your cells, and it's then converted into ATP or cellular energy. But this isn't the only way that the body produces energy. The body actually produces energy by harnessing sunlight, and how this then affects the water in our cells. And I know this sounds like really woo-woo or hippie-ish and pretty out there, but it is backed by a lot of science. And this was an idea that was first brought to my attention a couple of years ago, listening to Danny Roddy's podcast, where he did an episode talking about the theory of how cells works and how much of what is meant to happen doesn't really stack up when you start crunching the numbers. Because basically when you add up all the processes that certain cells are meant to be doing, if these things are meant to be solely done by ATP, there just isn't enough ATP produced, and it falls short pretty drastically. So I'll link in the show notes to that podcast if people want to give it a listen. It does get pretty technical, and it isn't the easiest to follow in certain parts for a layperson. But if you like nerding out on this stuff, then I definitely check it out. As part of the show, they regularly reference Gerald Pollack and his book, Cells, Gels, and the Edges of Life. So I probably went out and bought this book and read through it, And in a similar vein to the podcast, it's pretty tough going. It starts out easy enough to follow through, but then it gets into some pretty technical places. But I'll give you the very kind of stripped back or light version of what the book is saying. The book talks about how important water is for our cells, and that this water is not the simple substance that we tend to think of it as. So while we know of water as being in 3 different states, so like liquid or solid or vapor, there's actually a 4th state with water, which is where it behaves much more like a gel. And as a gel, water can become more structured and can do sort of quite extraordinary things. So Pollock has written another book called The 4th Phase of Water. I haven't read it, but I've seen other people reference it when talking about this topic. And Pollock's actually done a TEDx talk talking all about it. And it is pretty easy to understand and follow along. So I'm going to link in the show notes to that talk. And again, you can find the show notes at www.7, so seven-health.com/52. But the critical point what I want to make as part of this podcast is that one of the functions that water performs in our cells is that produces a charge that is like a battery, and that this battery then provides our body with energy. So on top of the energy we get from food and ATP, we also get energy from water. Now, how light and sunlight fits into all of this is that light is needed to have an impact on this water. So just like plants use light for photosynthesis, we use lights in our cells to produce energy. So one of the UV light's functions is it helps to separate water that is then needed to create this change in our cells. There are some potential dangers with UV light, and it is more likely to cause radiation damage that can lead to certain forms of cancer. UV light is strongest in the midpoints of the day and is stronger when the sun is more intense. So my recommendation to benefit from UV light, but to really minimize the damage, is to expose yourself without sunscreen prior to 10 a.m. and after 4 p.m. And depending on the heat of the sun and your complexion, you need to judge how long you can stay out with doing this without burning. But this is the best way to get in the useful UV light and for it to be helpful. And if you are someone where it's really hot, trying to do it as early as possible and doing it for, if it's only a matter of minutes that you can stand, but just getting some UV light where there isn't something blocking it like sunscreen. So the next light that I want to talk about is blue light. And for some people, they probably heard about the dangers of blue light and the problems that it can cause at nighttime. And these are issues that are real and they need to be combated against. But before I get into this, I want to explain about the benefits of blue light. So blue light is critical for daytime health, for waking up and for being alert. And from an ancestral perspective, it was largely the blue light in the morning that would start to wake us up and to get us moving. It was then the reduction of blue light in the evening that would then be part of why we would then get tired and start to go to sleep. So in its natural form, your body uses blue light from the sun to regulate your natural sleep and wake cycles. It's the light source that is crucial for regulating your circadian rhythm, which is the 24-hour body clock that we follow in terms of different organs and systems and hormones being higher or lower at different points in the day. So blue light is largely the conductor of this orchestra. So the blue light during the daytime, as I said, really important. Helps with being awake, with alertness, with feeling energized for like memory and cognitive function, and with mood. And so when people are suffering with SAD, so seasonal affective disorder, part of this is due to the lack of light during the day, and this includes the blue light. So the SAD lamps and different like dawn simulators that people use during this time, which is often normally in the winter time and more so for people who are living further away from the equator. So there's much more darker, longer parts of the day where it's darkness. By using these SAD lamps, you can be providing the body with a much higher amount of blue light. And this can be best for people to use them probably first thing in the morning or early in the morning, and then during the daytime, but not so much in the evening time. And the reason for that is like blue light does have some real drawbacks, and this is mainly because of getting it at the wrong time. And if you look at all the devices that you have in your home, so things like TVs, computers, laptops, tablets, phone, these all emit huge amounts of blue light. And even the light bulbs in your house will be doing this. So years ago when we were using incandescent bulbs, these emitted much less blue light and they were much more in the red spectrum. But with the switch to fluorescent lights and lots of LED lighting and a push for more like energy saving bulbs, these light sources now emit a much higher amount of blue light. And up until recently, like never before in history, as humans had we had access to blue light in the evening time. So we evolved for blue light to signal the body to be awake and for it to turn on certain functions and turn off other functions purely by just seeing that light field. So when looking at blue light in the evening time, it then really starts to mess with the circadian rhythm, and it makes it more difficult to get to sleep, or even if you are falling asleep, it prevents the best quality sleep where proper repair and recovery are taking place. And over time, people can start getting sleep deprived, they can be sleeping less, and this, when it's done like year after year, really starts to add up. And I will just add that poor sleep at night can also be due to lack of blue light in the daytime from the sun. So it's not only getting too much in the evening time, it can also come from too little during the daytime. So I want you to keep that in mind. And when sleep is being messed around with, lots of other hormones are affected. So it impacts on hormones that affect hunger and satiety and the types of foods that people crave. It affects the body's ability to deal with this food when it does come in, making things like insulin resistance or diabetes or heart disease or weight gain much more common. It increases the likelihood of depression. It makes it likely you'll get certain types of cancers, or more likely you'll get certain types of cancers. And what I would say is that some of these can be directly linked to blue light, and others I think are probably more of a consequence of it. And what I mean by that is, if someone is more tired, then they may have less energy and are therefore more sedentary or don't have the energy to make more of their own food, so they're eating more fast food. So it can be more the knock-on effect rather than blue light directly having an impact on someone in certain situations. But realistically, like all the evidence points toward the fact that if you are consistently exposing yourself to blue light in the evening, you're more likely to have health complications across like a whole range of different issues. So there are certain things you can be doing to minimize this. First, you can set a cutoff point for when you're going to use electrical devices in the evening. So for example, if you're watching TV or working on your laptop or being on your phone or your tablet, then you can set a time. So maybe like I don't use this stuff after 8 p.m. and after that time you're not looking at those screens. While I think this could be helpful, I don't think it's particularly practical for lots of people. Like these devices can be a way that people unwind in the evening, and stopping doing this may mean that they miss out on some of these benefits of unwinding. And a lot of times people do need to still be working at certain times in the evening, or do need to be checking their phone at certain times. And so it's just not practical for them to be doing this. So what you can do is you can find ways to block out the blue light. So one of them is a program called Flux that I have on my laptop, and what it does is it removes the blue light as the sun starts to set in the evening, and you can change it for when that will happen. And this means that if I am having to use my laptop in the evening, this blue light has been removed. The iPhone now has a setting that you can take out the blue light called night shift. You can set up the time of day that this happens. So in the evening, it will do this for you. I imagine you can do the same thing for your iPad, as well as for Android phones and Android tablets and for PCs. Another option is to get blue blocking glasses. And these look like sunglasses but have lenses that then filter out the blue light. And you can wear these in the evening time for the last couple of hours before going to bed to help block out the blue light. And they do take a little bit of getting used to. And I remember the first time that I wore them, they made everything like very orange and made it feel very dark. But I've now been using them for a while, and so as soon as I put them on, within a couple of seconds, I'm just adjusted and they feel very normal. And the same thing can happen when you start using Flux for the first time. The first couple of days I used it, it felt like my screen was like very red or very orange in the evening time. And now I don't even notice it, and I often think that it must be turned off or I haven't switched it on, and so I'll then go in, change the settings, and actually turn Flux off, and I'll notice how suddenly bright and glowing my screen starts to get, and I realize like it was on and it was having a huge effect, but I'm just so used to it now that I just don't notice it. So like if you are going to start using these things, just give it a little while and you will get used to it. With the glasses, you will probably look a little bit strange because you're essentially just wearing sunglasses inside. But if it's just like you and your partner in the house, or it's you and your kids or your flatmates, like you'll get over it very quickly and you'll forget that you're even using them. And for me, it's like only when I go and like to brush my teeth that I remember when I look in the mirror and see that I've got basically sunglasses on. One warning with this stuff for anyone who is a graphic designer: don't design anything at night if you're using Flux or you're wearing these glasses. It really messes with the colors, and so that when you look at your work the next day, it will be completely different and you probably won't like what you've done. So if you're a graphic designer and you have to be working in the evening, I wouldn't use Flux, and I just try and not have that be happening so often. I'd also add that people should be finding ways to get blue light at the right times. And so, as I mentioned, it's really important for wakefulness, for alertness, and for daytime functioning. So some ideas here is like in the morning time, getting in as much light early on as you can. So within the first 60, 90 minutes of the day, earlier if possible, spend some time outside. So ideally this would be somewhere around like 30 or 40 minutes. It could be you going for a walk, like getting some movement, but even if it's just you sitting outside, having some breakfast outside, or just sitting outside in the garden or whatever it may be, is going to be really helpful. Periodically throughout the day, you also want to be getting outside as well. So even if it's just like micro breaks for 5 minutes, it will really help. And it's going to help you for all of the different light spectrums. It's not just going to be the blue light. But we evolved to spend our lives outdoors, not inside, like sitting under fluorescent lights. And this is even more critical if your work environment lacks windows or lacks natural light. So I want to move on to the next spectrum, which is red and near infrared light. And these are actually two different types of light, but because they are next to one another on the light spectrum, they have a very similar effect on the body. And so they've been researched a lot of the time together. So most of the research, when I looked at it, it clumped them together, and it's easier just for me to talk about them together here. So red and near infrared light is incredibly important for energy production in your cells. And I mentioned earlier that there are two ways that the cells can produce energy. One is by turning food into ATP. The other is by impacting on water to create a charge and provide energy. Well, red light helps with both of these. So in respect to creating ATP and energy from food, red and near infrared light has an impact on the mitochondria in your cells. So the mitochondria is like the little power stations or factories or whatever that produce energy. And the red light will penetrate through your skin and into your cells, where it actually turns on an enzyme that then impacts on the mitochondria to increase energy production. So the more red and near infrared light that you get from the sun, the more ATP you can create from the food that you eat. And so this means that if the if the same amount of food is eaten in the wintertime versus the summertime, your body will be able to create more energy from this same food in the summer. And that's obviously assuming that the weather is nice in the summer and that you're actually spending time outdoors, exposing your skin to this stuff. And because of this light's increased ability to produce cellular energy, like red and near infrared light really increases our metabolism. And this is going to be another reason why people want to be spending as much time outdoors as they can, getting this red and near infrared light in. It also has a really beneficial effect on our hormones. So it helps to increase hormones that are associated with youth. So things like pregnenolone and progesterone and DHEA. It also helps to suppress the production and release of stress hormones. So things like cortisol and adrenaline. And this is really important. So when someone is in good health, cortisol will be highest in the morning time. So somewhere around about 8 or 9 a.m. Throughout the day, it starts to drop and should be then at its lowest in the evening time as people are getting ready for sleep. Its decrease in the evening allows for melatonin to then increase. And melatonin is a hormone that is needed for the body to get in the right mode for sleeping and is very much associated with good sleep. So melatonin then continues to be released while we sleep, and at around about 4 or 5 a.m., cortisol slowly starts to increase and melatonin slowly starts to come back down. And cortisol will then continue to rise, and as it increases, you slowly start to wake up and get going for the day, and then the process starts all over again. So because red and near infrared light then suppresses those stress hormones, it makes it the perfect light for us to be then exposed to, not just in the daytime, but in the evening time. And if we are to look at things from an evolutionary perspective, what was the light that we would have in the evening time? It would be fire. And fire provides the body with lots of red and near infrared light. So our ancestors would sit around a fire for a couple of hours in the evening before going to bed, and this would have a beneficial impact on our sleep. And this becomes even more important in the wintertime. So stress hormones like cortisol can actually start to rise more in the presence of darkness. So if the sun is going down at, say, 3 p.m. or 4 p.m. because you're living far away from the equator, and then it's not rising until 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. the next morning, this can be a very long time to have darkness. And cortisol then isn't going to follow the natural rhythm because the darkness is for so long and can start to then wanting to come up earlier than when you're going to be waking up. But if there is then lots of red light from, say, fire, from the time that the sun sets until when someone is then going to bed, there isn't going to be as long for this darkness, and therefore cortisol isn't going to be rising too early and messing with sleep. So this is something to be then keeping in mind for yourself. You're most probably not going to be sitting around a fire because that's just not what most people do these days. But using something like a dawn simulator or a SAD light during the daytime can be great to provide the body with blue light that's needed. But as the days get shorter and get darker as people are moving into the wintertime, the body is then missing out on a lot of that really beneficial red light. So a couple of suggestions. You can use a 250 watt red incandescent bulb, and you can get what's known as a chicken light or a brooder light that you can then put this bulb into. And you can then use this in the daytime, but more so I would be suggesting using it in the evening time to providing the body with more of that red light. I'll put a link to both the bulb and the chicken light in the show notes. Red and near infrared light is also really helpful for repair and for regeneration. Really useful in terms of reducing inflammation in the body. It is supportive against just so many different diseases, and lots of this is also due to its helpful impact on the immune system. It's also useful for repairing muscle. So this can be whether there's been like some trauma or someone's needing rehab, or it can just be from the fact that someone's got sore muscles from doing exercise. So basically, like any area that you shine like red or near infrared light on, it helps it for the better. And this shining of red light, it can come in a number of different forms. And so I've already talked about the like incandescent bulbs and getting the chicken lights. It can be from someone just going and doing more sunbathing and lying outside. It can come in the form of low-level laser therapy. And this is where there is a red laser that can then be shone on specific parts of the body. So, for example, if you're having back pain, you can shine the red light from the low-level laser onto the back. If you're having problems with your thyroid, you can shine the light onto your thyroid gland. Another option would be something like a red or near-infrared sauna. And you could probably find places around where you live that offer this, but you can also do these in your home. There's lots of different options that you can get on Amazon for this stuff, ranging from like a couple of £100 and going upwards. And what I'm going to do is I'll put a couple of these different options in the show notes. What I'm also going to do in the show notes is link to an article by Vladimir Heiskanen. I probably butchered his surname. It's an article that is incredibly well researched and goes into a lot of detail on the benefits of red and near infrared light. It links to like over 100 different studies looking at its different benefits. Vladimir is a really great researcher, and I first discovered his writing on near-infrared light and also writing about like glycine and some of the other amino acids back in 2013, 2014 on Matt Stone's 180 Degree Health. So have a look at the article on red and near-infrared light. If you like this article, I definitely recommend checking out some of his other stuff. So that is it for the different types of light spectrums and the benefits that they can have on our health. Like, really, the take-home message that I want you to get from this is that sunlight is very underappreciated as a promoter of health. It should probably be thought about in the same way that we do in terms of food or water or movement, that it is really necessary. And you should be spending as much time outside as you possibly can each day. And because so much of people's lives is spent indoors, you should be then harnessing the benefits of different types of light therapies to make up for this. So whether you're talking about sad light boxes or red lights or near infrared saunas, all of those things are going to be very helpful. And just being wary of getting the wrong types of light at night can be really problematic. So finding ways to block out that blue light to really spare your circadian rhythm. So getting the blue blocking glasses or using Flux or other similar programs. So that is it for today's show. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week, and I'll catch you next week.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.